Σας ευχαριστώ κύριε Τρομιλίδη. Εγώ θα μιλήσει αγγλικά. Είμαι επιστήμονας στην Αμερική. Η δουλειά τη γράφω στα αγγλικά, σκέφτομαι στα αγγλικά. Οι πηγές είναι ελληνικές, οθωμανικές, διάφορα, αλλά ελπίζω να μπορείτε και αν έχετε ερωτήσεις στη συζήτηση ίσως και μετά. Thank you for the invitation to be here with Professor Petromilidis and my colleagues, Dimitri Kamouzis, very excited, and Nico, and of course Varvara, and all the members of the center. And so I wanted to talk about this topic, which I think is a really fascinating one, οι πέτρες των Ρωμιών, το χῶμα του Σουλτάνου. It's a conflict between the Rum, the Greek Orthodox community of Kaysarεια, of Caesarea, or Kayseri, and it's a conflict between that community and the Armenians that takes place around 1850. I wanted to preface it, though, by explaining that this was a talk that I had prepared as part of a lecture, a conference on Kayseri that was supposed to take place in Kayseri in 2019. This was, of course, canceled by the local authorities of Kayseri with the idea that they could not protect the participants and offer enough to provide security for the conference. And then it was rescheduled for Istanbul. However, the night we arrived in Istanbul, the organizers said that too was canceled. So the paper was never delivered. We gathered as scholars to discuss amongst ourselves, but it wasn't a full-blown event. Eventually, this paper just was published in Turkish language. So this is the first time I'm actually going to really present to an audience some of the findings, something interesting case. So, just to orient ourselves, of course this is the Center for Asia Minor Studies, but when we consider what we're talking about, you can see on the map, this Kayseri is in the center of, this is a modern map of Turkey, and of course, here's a kind of satellite image of a Google map of the country. So I thought to begin by focusing on what the center has here. It's an oral history. Of course, one of the incredible treasures of the Center for Asia Minor Studies is the Oral History Archive. And so there's a recorded account by Thomas Milkoglu that was recorded November 11th, 1958. And he describes a case of building of the Church of St. Nicholas. And I'll read the passage. In 1850 to 52, they built the Church of St. Nicholas in Kayseri. The Greeks thought that they could bring the stones from St. Mercurius and use them to build their church. However, the Armenians of Kayseri protested. The Armenians said, "The stones are ours." And the Greeks replied, "No, they are ours." It became a serious issue, so they ended up in court. Back then, the Metropolitan of Kayseri, Paisios, was Paisios, so he went to Constantinople. There, the Patriarchate acted fast, and after a while, they managed to obtain a firman from the Sultan that said that the dirt belonged to the Turks and the stones to the Greeks. In Turkish, it read, Topra Turkun Taş Rumun. That's how the Greeks went and took the stones and built the Church of St. Nicholas. They even made a song about it. And so this is his description of what happens, how do you build the church. So in this late Ottoman period, 1850s, the local Greek Orthodox, I'm going to use the term Rum or Greek Orthodox interchangeably, in the city of Kayseri and the surrounding villages, they attempted to rebuild and repair church buildings throughout the region. Such capital projects were not just a matter of securing the finances, but they were actually much more ambitious projects. They required getting imperial permission, gathering funds, hiring architects and builders, and then initiating and even completing projects. They were communal enterprises led by the clergy, and in the case of the Greek Orthodox community, the Metropolitan of Caesarea, Paisios II, who was the Metropolitan from 1832 to 1871, he himself was responsible for dozens of constructions throughout the region. This required the local population to marshal all of their resources in order to ensure success. It also required gathering stones. So apparently, when Thoma and Mirkoglu in 1958 is talking about this, he is bringing a memory of 100 years prior, which I think is an amazing, interesting feature. And what I think it offers, when we look at this, we see a conflict, and by examining this conflict, we have to think about what sources actually also exist. And I'm going to describe two other sources in addition to the Ottoman sources. First, it would be, we have a series of the oral history sources, but then there is the source of Anastasios Levidis, and I'll explain his importance, and then the Ottoman Archives also corroborate all of this. Now, I'll just kind of briefly summarize, just for purposes, the idea of building churches in the Islamic sense, in the Islamic context, has been studied by historians like Rositsa Gredeva for the early modern era, who focuses on the building and rebuilding of churches. She describes the idea that Ottomans were heavily influenced by the Hanafi Islamic legal tradition. These are ideas of Islamic tradition that extend all the way back to the early Islamic period. In order to repair church buildings, they're required to receive special permission before undertaking any repair, either from the Sublime Porte, the kind of Sultan, or from the local Qadi who was in charge. In either case, the local Qadi had to oversee the repair of the buildings, and the Christians had a right to do this. They also had the right, interestingly, to construct new buildings, new churches. However, this was a little bit more delicate. According to Hanafi law, Christians technically were allowed only to repair in Muslim areas, and if it's a Christian village or a Christian area, then they were entitled to apply to build a new structure. So even with these restrictions, though, it's interesting because the Christians have, in the 19th century, tremendous success in building churches. Towards the end of the 18th century, there's this added element, and this I described the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, which takes place in 1774, and this is the treaty concluding a Russian-Ottoman war, in which the Russians insist on the rebuilding of a church, or building of a church in Istanbul, and it describes that a church should be built in the district of Galata, in the quarter called Beyoğlu. It's to be public, it's to call the title of the Russo-Greek Church, and would be under the protection of the minister of the Russian government. So the Russians, this is kind of an indication that the Russians had an interest in promoting and protecting the Christian population, especially the building and rebuilding of churches. This, of course, extends even more during the Tanzimat period, which describes the Tanzimat is a period of reform in the 1830s to mid-1850s, specifically. And in there's additional permission granted and freedoms to non-Muslims in order to provide for their churches, to reconstruct, to rebuild. And so it's during this period that you have quite a lot happening. The interesting thing that happens, though, is that when you begin to look at the building of churches, it begins much earlier. So we find churches, the rebuilding process in the early 1700s. We have examples even earlier. So the Christians were never at a loss for wanting to repair and rebuild. They were aware of the foundations of old structures, and they went to those to try to rebuild those. So I just thought to give you a sense of the region. This is kind of Kayseri. I had marked the one place, Darsiyak. In the very first slide I showed, there was an image of a built church. It's the monastery of Taxiarchis. But this is the city of Kayseri. It's in central Cappadocia. This is the church of Germir, and these are just kind of sample the number of churches, the churches that had been rebuilt. The plans are done by a colleague of mine, Sajid Pekak. Together we had done the survey of multiple churches throughout the region, and it was a project funded by the National Endowment for Humanities. And so this is the church of Talas. You can see these are monumental structures, right? And so these are around the same time period. This is the church of Taxiarchis in monastery. With Professor Kitromelidis, we actually visited both of those buildings, I think, as well.
This one is a mosque now.
This is now a mosque, right?
That's why it's in a well preserved condition.
Absolutely. So that's a comment worth noting, that churches that are reused after the Christian population is through the exchange is removed. Oftentimes they're used as storage houses, sometimes as barns. It's a very kind of difficult thing to witness. When they are mosques, they are preserved and the building structure is fully intact. When they're not, like this church, you'll see, and these are some of the drawings, this is the state. And these are just through people coming in and hanging out and being destructive.
Is it a Taxiarchis?
Yes, this is Taxiarchis. In this case, it was actually a very deliberate attack on the church structure by one of the local mayors. He himself actually dynamited, because these buildings are so strong, so well built, but this was an intentional kind of destruction of the dome. So it makes this building useless. It has all of these things. And of course, this is kind of the altar. And there's also this tradition, not tradition, but a feature where people go into the churches thinking that treasure has been buried, and so they go under and they start digging, and they go through, and the Turkish authorities, they have to put signs, and the signs mean nothing, of course, but no digging, they say no excavating, right? It's kind of, but of course people do. And this is a view from the top of that Taxiarchis dome. So I thought you would just get a sense of the scale, the quality of construction, not you might have dynamited the dome, but the rest of the roof is still intact. So, and you see evidence of iconography and other things that are taking place. This church was associated with St. Helena for her pilgrimage trips to the Holy Lands. And there's, in the oral history archives, and even Anastasios Levidis describe the kind of mythic connections to, or the connections to, the St. Helena. So, focusing now on St. Nicholas. Turning to our first source, that's a significant source, Anastasios Levidis. He was a native of Cappadocia. He was a Hellenist scholar. He was a teacher. He was also a priest. And in 1897, Anastasios Levidis wrote what is still an unpublished and in many respects an unparalleled Historikon Dokimion Perigrafi Kappadokias, the historical studies description of Cappadocia. This is from our the center here. And so, as a local scholar, Levidis was extremely adept. He was at linguistic studies. In fact, he even offers his assistance to the British scholar Richard Dawkins in his work on modern Greek in Asia Minor. And he was a teacher at the famous school of Zingidere, which is the village in which the metropolitan see of Kayseri was located. And so this church, this school and this church were very important. Levidis was a fierce anti-Protestant preacher who wrote tracts in Karamallidica, which most know is Turkish language but with Greek characters. And he also focused on his Turkish-speaking Greek community. So this text describes the villages in 1897. He went from village to village in the region, and he examined the churches, he examined the communities, made notations about all of what he noticed, and he gives a comprehensive survey of these villages, the religious, educational life. He also identifies books and manuscripts that are located in each of the churches, and he gives some general demographic remarks. And interestingly, even though this book hasn't been translated, in 1905, much of the material that he gathers is published in one of the Imerologia of Constantinople, done by the Patriarchate and the community. And so he submits, and much of what I'm actually discussing, or some of the details, end up getting published in this other Imerologia. Just to mention, he says that there were two Greek Orthodox churches located in Kayseri. St. Nicholas, which was the metropolitan church in the center of the city, and St. Basil, which was located outside in the suburbs. It seems ironic, of course. St. Basil, you would imagine, would be the main church. Nevertheless, St. Nicholas is the one he describes as having been reconstructed on older foundations of carved stones in 1850. He mentions that he identifies one of the great things about Levidis' description. He says, he goes and marks other earlier inscriptions. So it gives us a sense of what else happened. He describes an inscription in the Byzantine year 7097, which translates approximately 1589, that there was a reconstruction and foundation stones were laid in the 1589. Then there's another reconstruction, and he gives us another inscription. In 1678, on August, under the reign of Sultan Suleiman, was renovated the Divine and Holy Church of our St. Nicholas in the Metropolia of Caesarea. The church was inaugurated by the Archpriest, His Holiness Metropolitan of Caesarea and Cappadocia, Lord Kyprianou. And so the wonderful thing about Levidis is now he's making these notations. The reign of Suleiman is incorrect at this point. Nevertheless, so I can't really account for why that's the case, but Levidis gives us this notice. In one of the books that he finds at the St. Nicholas Church, there's a triodion. A triodion is a liturgical book that kind of details the pre-Lent all the way up to the end of Holy Week. And it's with all the hymnology and all of the events. And in that book, in the cover, is described that there was a terrible earthquake on August 1st, 1835, which caused tremendous damage. So the books themselves end up becoming notation places for history, like events, important events. They're the way ancient medieval monks chronicled things in their Bibles or in liturgical books. This Triodion had this. It mentioned this earthquake that damaged Kayseri, surrounding villages in the east, destroying houses, minarets, and killing about 500 people. So a very kind of important, devastating event. Then there is a second earthquake on August 17th, 1835, which caused people to leave their houses and sleep in their gardens and in the fields. Yet another occurred on January 29th, 1836. So right away we have this sense that something dreadful happened, the churches are kind of destroyed. This is the reason why there's a need to rebuild. According to the oral history, just to kind of give us a sense of where these things are, let's see if I have, sorry, just to kind of say, these earthquakes of course cause great devastation, and now they have a plan to reconstruct. When they begin the process, Levidis gives another kind of, he gives another inscription. He describes it and writes it down. This time, this is a Karamanlidika inscription. And the first one was in Greek, and now the second one is in Karamanlidika. This is the Greek one. Let me begin with this one. To you who look from above, our King, the people of Caesarea devoted a church which exalts the Bright One. But you have your own house, though. You are not contained, not even in the heavens where you have palms. Your house is like a poem to the higher power, which is unspoiled for the pious heart. To your church we come frequently to cleanse our souls, and we are sanctified. But you wish the inner sanctum of the temple to heal us by St. Nicholas. And this is May 21, 1850, the dedication. So this is the Greek inscription that Levidis offers us. There's a second inscription that he gives us. And this, of course, is probably directed to the local population, who are Karamanlidika speakers, or Turkish speakers. And so in this you can see the Karamanlidika on the left, the Greek letters in the Turkish, and I gave the Turkish description on the right. This says, this holy church of St. Nikolaos, which is the mother of the people of Cappadocia, during the reign of Abdul-Majid Khan, who ruled with power, in the time of Paisios of Caesarea, every stone was brought from Deliktaş by the Rum Millet. So, interesting. We have now a Greek inscription, that's the formal one for the church, now and a second one which is for the people to see. The people, though, as they're reading this, they see three things. They see, of course, that Abdul-Majid Khan is the emperor, the sultan, that it was in the time of Paisios, who's a significant player in this story, and third, that there are stones coming from a very specific place, Deliktaş, brought by the Rum Millet, the Rum community. So with this said,
the inscriptions are reported by Levidis.
And they don't exist otherwise.
Yes. So our only record is Levidis.
The only record is Levidis. And so to kind of move us a bit further in the story, here's an image of Paisios that I mentioned. He was mentioned in this, this document. But it's the stones themselves that become the issue for this church and what took place. And so here we wanted to turn back to the oral histories. Okay. I like how Ioana Petropoulou describes these as democratized sources. You get the idea of the inscriptions are formal from the church, from those people who, and Levidis, of course, being an educated man, is recording them, but now there's also this alternate view from people who are descendants or witness the churches themselves, and were part of that story. So the oral history informant who opened our talk, Thomas Milkoglu, explains that this church was built during the time of his grandmother in 1850. He estimated the cost to be about £5,000. It was built by the Rum community and was located inside the walls of the Kayseri city. And so this is actually the pages of Milkoglu, just giving you a sense. If those of you have not worked ever with these archives, they're handwritten. For the most part, some are typed up as well here and there. But it's just an amazing work from Melpomene kind of assessment. Here is another description. It's actually an image that we have in the archive showing that there is the church itself, its location. There are two ways to enter. One is through the Kichakapi that leads to Kangi Pazarı, that leads to the outskirts of the city, and there is another entrance on the other side near the school. There's a school located next door, and the square in front of the church is called Meclis-i Vâlâ. So the informants are even drawing descriptions of this location. Now, to give us a sense of where this is a city map of from 1940. 1882 on this one. And so you can see, those of you who know Kayseri, there's an ancient Justinianic era Kale that's then rebuilt subsequently. It's a castle, fortress at the city. And the church is located at that point there. And there are two other churches that are Armenian. And I think the suburb church is even a little bit further out towards this region. So we see two Armenian churches located here. And in 1940, during the reconstruction of the city, rebuilding of the city, the Turkish authorities razed those neighborhoods. And so if you can see the Kale there, and that's the location there. I think it's, I remember going the last time when we went as a group and seeing that there was like a major bank and some other offices and buildings around. It's a commercial district now. So the church no longer exists.
How about the Armenian churches?
They do. In fact, these two churches...
Go back to the previous?
Yes.
The two Armenian churches.
This one, they both exist still.
They both exist.
Yeah.
One actually is functioning.
That was a functioning one, yeah. And this is the one that we saw.
St. Nicholas was not too far from there.
No,
yeah.
No.
So the other Armenian church exists also?
Yes, yeah. Yes. And one of them still functions, as you said.
Yeah.
There's a small group of maybe 4 or 5 families of Armenians that still live in Kayseri. So just to kind of identify again, the building no longer exists. St. Nicholas had been torn down. It was part of this reconstruction project of the 1940s. So I wanted to return back to one of the sources. This is actually a source who also describes this account. It's Christos Yorganzoglou. I should have the date he was interviewed, but also within the 50s. He says, when the Christians of Kayseri decided to build the Church of St. Nicholas, they were met with opposition from the Armenians because the church would block the view from the mansion of a wealthy Armenian. After they argued for a while, the dispute focused on whether the Christians had the right to take and use stones from an abandoned church outside of Kayseri, while the Armenians argued the old church had been theirs. The trial that was held in Kayseri decided in favor of the Armenians. So the Christians decided to ask the help of the Sultan and brought his firman back with them. And the stones belong to the Greeks, or to the Ρωμιῶν, I should say, to Ρωμιῶν. The dirt belongs to the Sultan. And this is the title. This is where we get the title. Οι πέτρες των Ρωμιών, το χῶμα του Σουλτάνου. Drunk with excitement, the Greeks, women, men, and children began carrying the stones, singing a song they made up on the spot. So, how do we verify these things? When we talk about, this is one of the challenges of using the sources of the center. And many people say, and this is not just because of the center, but any oral history is often minimized as a historical source because oftentimes they're imbued with personal accounts, the memory is often very faulty, and so there's all sorts of reasons to discount these things. However, what's interesting is that these 100-year-old memories actually capture what had taken place. And why do we know this? We know it because when you go into the Ottoman archives, the archives of the Prime Ministry, and you begin a search, and you start looking for these things, it's not easy to locate very specific cases. But in this case, we were able to find a series of constructions and reconstructions in the region of Cappadocia. And so there's an electronic catalog which assists in the process. The archive is an open archive, so anybody can go in with permission and make their research. And so these are actually, I'm just giving you an example of the Church of Agios Georgios in Talas, which in fact has both the Ottoman appeal to the Ottomans and a decision, as well as a plan of the church structure, because they had to supply that into the state. And those things reside in the Ottoman state archive. So with that, there are a number of examples like that. So among the documents that are found for this, there are basically four, with a couple other references to the case. And so it begins in July 8, 1850, with a petition made by the Greek community to the authorities, describing them as the poor slave Rum community, whose homeland is in Kayseri. The Kayseri de Mutevatan Rum Taifise Fukara Kularanın. So it's described kind of this poor, Fukara community of the Rum. The petition states that there was a dispute between the Rum community of Kayseri, who were trying to use stones, including gravestones, out of an ancient cemetery to build a church. And the Armenians who are intervening who said that the site was theirs. The document describes how the representatives of the Rum community of Kayseri came forward because their own church had been ruined. They stated that they had received appropriate permission from the Sultan to repair the ruined church. In order to do this, they determined it was necessary to confiscate a number of the tombs from a graveyard that they knew very well. At the moment the ancient stones were being prepared, they were taking some limestone blocks also from an old building that had collapsed. The leaders of the Armenians came forward and with members of their community surrounded the Greek Orthodox craftsmen in carriages and began attacking them, forcing them to stop their work. The Armenians went to appeal to the Pasha Effendi, who was absent, and ended up speaking to the town mayor, Ismail Effendi, who was the local authority. Ismail Effendi did not pay attention to the imperial authority and opposed the Sultan's permission. He appeared to have made a decision in favor of the Armenians. He went to the Armenian leaders, the Kocabaşı Laronu, and granted them the ruined church. Not pleased with this local decision, the Rum community submitted a petition to what is identified as a Supreme Court, the Meclis-i Vâlâ-yı Ahkâm-ı Adliye, to resolve this issue. The community appealed based on what's kind of a faulty claim, saying that during the time of Mehmet the Conqueror, there were no Armenians in Kayseri, which is not true, but they made that claim. As a result, the old church should belong to the Greek Orthodox. So the Supreme Court then decides that this ruined church and cemetery should revert to the petitioners, the Rum community, and any obstacles to its use would be removed. This was to take place by order of the Sultan. So this is the extent, this is the kind of summary of the Ottoman document that we have, describing fairly clearly the Milkoglu account and the Yorganzoglu account. There's another note in August 24th describing the dispute more generally. And then, of course, there's a decision that goes to the Ankara governor, the Vali, in September 9th, 1850, that again offers a similar command, but here it says, it acknowledged the dispute by saying that in order to repair the church belonging to the Rum community of Kayseri, the Rum community removed stones from their cemetery. When they did this, they were met by Armenian leaders who prevented the construction work from taking place. The Armenian leaders stopped the work by threatening with the Rum, and they add this with guns and by beating them. Right? So they add another detail, which makes it a little bit even more pronounced. However, the decision of the Ankara Vali says the cemetery is owned by the Rum community. And moreover, things that were removed from it do not belong to the Armenians. So this letter stated the decision was then conveyed to the district governor of Kayseri. So as a result of all of this, we can see the Ottoman authority clearly sided with the Greek Orthodox. It was the final word on the situation. And they were able to, as a result of using these Ottoman documents, were able to confirm this conflict and see how the community was able to use the Ottoman administration to achieve its goals and to receive a positive resolution in their favor and opposing and over against the Armenians. So now I just wanted to kind of wrap up with some general remarks and ideas. First thing I think that's important to say is that in 1850, the Greek Orthodox found it necessary to build a new church. They understood it required permission, but it was a fairly liberal period in which to build. And so they took advantage of this opportunity. Secondly, the Greek Orthodox community understood, they appeared to understand what was actually at stake. In an age when all of these reconstructions are taking place, that it's not just the community, but also the metropolitan and perhaps even the patriarch needs to intervene in order to use their influence to get things done. So this is an additional aspect. So Metropolitan Paisios, in the accounts, we only see his activity in the oral history accounts. Interesting, we don't see them in the Ottoman accounts. There's no mention of clerics or patriarchs in the Ottoman account. So it does mean that the community still has, maybe the Ottomans are not paying attention to it. We don't really know why that's not the case. But the community has a full kind of confidence to approach the Sultan on a major dispute like this. The other thing is that another observation, the Ottoman administration did not treat this necessarily as a trial where they had to show evidence. They simply listened to the appeal and made an assessment. Had they, in other cases that I've read before, the Ottomans often say, go and investigate this matter. There's another case I studied before. Go investigate this matter and return with your findings, and then we'll discuss. It's simply, they wanted to solve this problem, and they kind of, it was an administrative matter for them. They weren't to this. I did want to mention that from the Armenian sources, while I don't read Armenian, I worked with someone who had access, identified some items. And so there is, from the Armenian side, recognition of a church of St. Mercurius. They actually, in a 1937 work, there's a church mentioned by the Armenians. Even further back, I'm just kind of saying, one of the authors of one of these accounts says that there's a medieval manuscript of 1206 that mentions a church of St. Mercurius. So the Armenians clearly had claim to a church of St. Mercurius. There's also another so from that standpoint, the Armenians knew very well that they also had claims to a structure like that. The scholar Al-Boyajian, though, when he writes about this account, does not mention the controversy, which I found surprising. It doesn't appear in their record. Perhaps because they lost and they gloss over this. It's not really clear. But the fact is that he's, he was an Armenian, if you want to use the term apologist, and he was looking for any residue, Armenian residue in anything. And he makes the claim about St. Mercurios, but he doesn't mention that the Greeks stole it from us or anything like that. That's not the case. So there's one other instance in 1860. So kind of, I'm going back now to the time period, just to mention a couple more cases that take place. 1860, there's another petition that's filed in order to, the room also have a discussion over whether they have rights to certain stones. And the government clearly says, no, these are the room. Like, the question was coming up again in a case in 1860, and the government shuts it down and says, no, these are Greek Orthodox stones. So it's kind of interesting that the state really does not want to deal with this issue. Milkoglu gives one other case, though, which kind of is interesting. He says that in the early 20th century, he remembers, or from his family, that there was another set of ruins that were dedicated, let's say, to a church of Panagia in a location. And he says that in both of the Greeks and the Armenians would, as they head to a funeral, right, and they have a funeral procession and head off, each community, when they had their ritual and rite, would bring the casket, lay it down on those specific ruins, say, I guess it would be a tisayo or some sort of prayer, and then go on to the actual funeral in a case. So ruins are plentiful in this region, and they are being now shared. And Milkoglu actually describes a case where the Armenians and the Greeks are co-sharing a structure, especially for funeral rites. This is one of the important things. And then one last case that happens in 1908, which is kind of at the tail end of the story of Hellenism and the Greek Orthodox in this region. They're now trying to rebuild the church of St. Basil of Caesarea. And once again, and I'll just read a guy named Kazanzoglu. He says, in 1908, when they started building the new church of St. Basil, they thought about removing columns and other materials from the church of Moros, one of the other villages, that they had demolished that same year since the Greeks had left forever. The governor of Kayseri, as soon as he heard about that the materials from the church of Moros would be used by the Greeks, they wished to take it away. He wished that, now I'm a little confused, I have to go back to this source. It says, the Greeks, in an attempt to steer clear of trouble, pretended they didn't know anything about the columns. In the end, they transported them to Kayseri. However, the church of St. Basil was never finished, and it was left half done, and in the end it was taken over by the Turks, and that was the end of it. So even in this last case, in 1908, there's an attempt to use churches to reconstruct St. Basil, and the governor is kind of trying to, again, not get too involved, but nevertheless, the Greeks, they end up proceeding and bring the columns to the new structure. So, just to conclude, in fact, we visited this church. It's an Armenian church. And so the irony that happens...
It doesn't look Armenian, it looks Orthodox.
It looks completely as a Greek structure. It's actually the Church of the Virgin Mary, Surg Azvadzadzin. And when we had gone, I'd been many years before, it was a sports club. I think they were doing karate in that. And then when we went, it was actually under renovation, and now it's a cultural center. But if you look at sources, like various Greek Orthodox sources, they describe it as Agios Nikolaos, right? The Church of St. Nicholas. it even kind of enters into the common parlance of the internet, right, as Aya Nikola Kilisesi. So it causes great confusion. I think that was the... and so Greek guidebooks especially are keen on showing this as the Greek structure, but in many ways it's, well, we're going back to the original conflict. We have the conflict between Armenians and Greeks, this time over this structure, and it's still, is it St. Nicholas or not? And the Greeks will say it is. However, the archaeological evidence and the inscriptions, having gone into that church and witnessed it myself, the inscriptions are Armenian, and it's an Armenian structure. But it's, I think, ironic that after so many years, this 1850 conflict between Armenians and Greeks that took place happens once again in the pages and on the internet. So thank you very much.